Buckle up, because this Disfarers episode's 8.5 horses of freewheeling adventure through the history, mechanics, and all-around fun info about Disneyland's unparalleled Autopia. There's a lot of ground to cover here about Disneyland's only Tomorrowland attraction still in existence. The attraction's popularity has had surprisingly stark highs and lows over the decades, the reasons for which will all be thoroughly explained. Not to mention the sheer number of changes made to the vehicles, sponsors, tracks, the rethemings, and evolution to the attraction itself, as well as the future is where Autopia is possibly headed. Many people believe this attraction is just for children, but really, when you learn the history of it, Autopia is so much more. So let's get started.
Start your engines!
So in 1953, the original vision for Disneyland's Tomorrowland, interestingly called Walt Disney's World of Tomorrow at the time, was drawn up, displaying the first idea for a vehicle driving attraction. It was described by Walt as a, quote, little parkway system, where children could drive scale model motor cars over a modern freeway, which at the time was a new concept being slowly implemented across the country. Until this point in US history, there were just mainly single-lane roads leading places, and not all of them were paved. The largest of them was the paved Lincoln Highway, that spanned 110 feet at its widest point, which not so coincidentally, President Eisenhower helped work on in his younger military days, but we'll get to him later. Today, however, I think Route 66 is the more widely remembered highway, the third largest highway before the government's implementation of highways during the 50s, and Route 66 was only as wide as 2 lanes at the height of its use. So you get the idea, before the time of Autopia, road systems were nowhere near what's used today. Freeways, which by definition are different from highways because they have controlled access ramps, today we essentially call them exits, was a newfound exciting advancement taking place around the nation. And you were only too lucky if one happened to be near you. Now, a Disney accountant, Milt Albright, was really into cars. He was actually the guy at the time who would write out Walt Disney's paychecks from Walt Disney's company. Which is actually kind of neat. Milt was the guy that would literally walk into Walt's office and hand him his paycheck. Anyway, Milt Albright heard or saw something about this vehicle attraction for this big upcoming Disney amusement park. So this bean counter here worked nights and weekends for 8 months to create a miniature fiberglass body prototype, inspired after a 1954 Corvette for Walt to test drive. Walt gets one look at this car, gets excited, hops in, and starts driving, only to realize the thing had no brakes. So Walt crashed the car into a wall in order to stop it, and the fiberglass body split open like a walnut, according to Milt Albright. So this prototype wasn't exactly used for Autopia, nor was Walt impressed, but it may have gotten the ball bearings moving in a certain direction, so to speak. And Milt didn't precisely get the attention he wanted from Walt, however, he did impress himself enough to secure a position as manager of accounting at Disneyland. Walt even stated, anyone that crazy belongs at Disneyland. It just so happened that Autopia didn't exactly have a ton of pre-production time scheduled, at this point called the Freeway of the Future. To combat this time-sensitive issue, some of the best minds at Disney were brought together to not only design the attraction, but make it a reality, and quick. Dick Irvine, the guy who launched Disney's artists, architects, designers, and engineers to form Disneyland, essentially creating Walt Disney Imagineering, held the first meeting for Autopia in October of 1954. Keep in mind, Disneyland opened with Autopia in July of 1955, 9 months later. So the entire attraction project was accomplished from start to finish in a remarkably short period of time. Bill Martin was brought in as the art director. He was the designer of many of Disneyland's iconic attractions such as Sleeping Beauty's castle, and was actually the art director for the creation of Disneyland's Fantasyland. He also contributed years later with the creation of Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion, so Autopia's art direction was in his extremely talented hands. Roger Brokey Sr. was the head of Disney Studios' machine shop, as well as Disneyland's transportation specialist, so he was also on Autopia's research and development for the miniature cars. Years later, he was a main contributor in the creation of the world's first audio-animatronic human figure, Abraham Lincoln. So Roger here decided to reach out to a company in West Germany to fashion a small 2-stroke engine-powered vehicle. A 2-stroke engine, by the way, is basically the same sort of engine that powers mopeds, scooters, model airplanes, and tuk-tuks. While the West Germans were hard at work, Roger moved on to develop a bumper design for these two-stroke engine vehicles. The end result was a pale yellow and green Studebaker sort of car that Walt Disney flat out rejected. And who could blame him? Roger Broggie Sr. was a brilliant man, participated in breakthroughs for technology and mankind. But I mean, everyone's entitled to a concept that's completely off now and again, but this one is hard to defend. It's difficult to imagine this Studebaker concept as any sort of representation of the future in Tomorrowland.
No privacy at all around this place.
Then there's Bob Gurr, the man himself, an actual automobile engineer. He actually got his start at Disney on Autopia. I mean, he's such a car guy that it makes perfect sense, but it's so perfect that it just makes his history with Disney all the more iconic. And up to this point, before Autopia, he'd already worked with Ford on designing the Continental, as well as ironing out its mass production kinks. And he was only 23 years old at the time, working for Disney part-time on nights and weekends. So, seeing as how Broggie's Studebaker concept was rejected, Disney started over on the chassis and drive with Johnny Hartman, from Hartman's engineering company of Montrose, California. Johnny Hartman's Roadsters won a lot of races in an era when Roadsters were a much bigger deal. Strangely, I couldn't find many pictures of him, but he's the relatively nondescript gentleman on the left of this picture here. For some reason that's not public knowledge, Hartman Engineering bowed out of the Autopia project after Bob Gurr reworked their chassis. But this wasn't all bad. It led to Bob Gurr being hired on full-time at Disney on January 3rd, 1955. He humbly/confidently gave himself the title of Director of Vehicle Design, and was also put in charge of developing the body for the cars. Bob Gurr complained that the Studebaker concept vibrated horribly and made a lot of smoke and noise. However, if it weren't so bad, it may not have led to the first of Autopia's sporty, state-of-the-art cars. He said it was a blend of a 1954 Porsche 550 Spider, which was new at the time, and the 53-54 custom Italian Ferraris. It really was an impactful aesthetic blend that made people excited to hop in to drive. Kids, adults, teens, tweens, retirees, you name it. Bob Gurr presented his sketches to Walt after about a week, although, as you can imagine, changes and alterations were proposed. The designs were tweaked and refashioned a number of times, honing this fantastic new creation. When Walt eventually approved the final design, Bob made a clay sculpture for others to work from. And while all of this was going on, the development of the overall attraction of course continued. There were all kinds of updates and changes. One idea they were running with was for Autopia to actually teach children how to handle an automobile while in a safe environment. Starting out by traversing an overpass, underpass, cloverleaf, and straightaway. In this early iteration, children would essentially learn how to steer and accelerate a vehicle. Which I mean, in many ways it does. And this idea actually developed into a Disneyland driver's license that I'll explain a little later. But anyway, the concept of the attraction ultimately became about the standardized interstate highway system being proposed by President Eisenhower's White House that had yet to be signed by this point. Which of course also consisted of freeways, starting the complicated necessary infrastructure we all take advantage of today. This was the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, incidentally leading to the winding decline of such places as Route 66, but exciting the imagination of Americans ready to step into the world of tomorrow. While many, if not most, of Disneyland's cars, stagecoaches, buggies, and what have yous were created at the sound stages of Walt Disney Studios, Autopia's first fleet of vehicles were instead made by Mameco. This tiny industrious company was an automotive engineering firm in Newport Beach, California. Its strange name was an acronym for Martindale and Mangles Engineering Company. Ed Martindale and Ted Mangles were the CEOs, best friends their entire lives actually, after meeting while in the military. Together they made the first fiberglass-bodied race car called the Glasspar, after campaigning it for the Glasspar Company, which actually competed against much larger factory teams such as Jaguar at Pebble Beach. The first driver of the Glasspar actually quit because he found the car to be way too fast, which led to Martindale and Mangles figuring that they weren't going to be able to sell cars, so they dropped out of racing. However, it was around this troubling time that Bob Gurr spoke to Bill Tritt, the owner of the Glasspar Company, about making the fiberglass bodies for the Autopia vehicles. Bill Tritt not only agreed but referred Bob Gurr to Martindale's and Mangle's Memeco company to create the chassis and for assemblage. So yeah, this small company made all of Autopia's original cars, which may sound strange, but at the time there weren't large factories to take concepts like Autopia's vehicles to research and develop them. The only places to go to were, quote, backyard operations. Bob Gurr gathered the parts needed for assembly and brought them to Memeco, where 40 of the 5/8 scale cars were put together. These prototypes, known as the Mark I's, hit a top speed of 11 miles per hour and had a 3.5-gallon gas tank, getting 27 miles per gallon, according to Disney. The cars were originally outfitted with 1-cylinder 6.5 horsepower engines, before being changed to 7.5 horsepower air-cooled internal combustion engines mounted in the rear. And in case you don't know what air-cooled means, it just means the surrounding air is used to cool the engine rather than water or oil. Anyway, this same engine was used for the lightweight 75 Mustang motorcycle, produced by the Gladden Products Corporation. Each of these Mark I's were also equipped with a centrifugal clutch. The frames were 160 pounds, fabricated from a 2-inch square cast iron tubing and 1-inch pipe, for those that understand that sort of thing. Again though, Martindale and Mangles made things fast, in the case of the Mark I's as much as 25 miles per hour, so a governor was attached to each car's carburetor to keep them from going too fast. Going about 10 to 11, though I've heard possibly as high as 14 miles per hour. A tripping device was placed under each chassis so the brakes engaged when someone took pressure off the accelerator. A spring-loaded handbrake was also installed along the side of the vehicles. This long lever allowed adults to overrule kids from throttle stomping the cars non-stop. What's also pretty interesting is that the Mark I's had 2 accelerator pedals, conveniently fashioned for differing lengths of the driver's leg, an automatic transmission, a spring-loaded throttle, an automatic spring-loaded braking system, a 7-to-1 rack and pinion style steering system, which this image and animation can more concisely explain than I ever could, a foam rubber dashboard for safety, seeing as how originally everyone wanted to crash into one another, nifty chrome handrails for hopping in and out of the vehicle with ease like Kirk Douglas in The Racers, which was this racing movie everyone knew about in 1955. Anyway, the Mark I's also had Naugahyde bench seats, the same actual material used for the Retlaw passenger cars of the Santa Fe and Disneyland railroads, and who doesn't enjoy saying the word Naugahyde? And sealed beam headlights powered by 6-volt generators, though these were soon after removed. All told, as I pretty much just did, the Mark I's weighed roughly 474 pounds. While all of this production was going on down at Memeco, Bob Gurr was nonetheless very involved. He would often visit to see how things were going and to add his input. These were all car guys in their 20s, so I imagine they all got along really well. Anywho, Martindale urges Bob Gurr to do a test drive with the governor removed from one of the cars. And incidentally, so it's told, Bob Gurr actually crashed into a parked car in front of Newport Beach's police department. But anyway, devising the Autopia attraction, I'm sure, seems like it would be a straightforward design process. But seriously, it took a lot of work to sort out the kinks of exactly what Autopia would be. Originally, there wasn't a guide rail, and when the test drivers got out there, they nearly obliterated the cars as they repeatedly crashed into one another. But you know, time was running short as opening day approached. I figured that they must have figured that they would just tell people not to hit each other, which doesn't sound so crazy. Now, the Memeco Disney business arrangement wasn't exactly long. However, the boost from the partnership with Disney during Memeco's turbulent time kept the company afloat, after which they fortunately secured a stable platform serving the yachting industry with products and repairs. So everyone walked away happy from the venture. On April 2nd of 1955, just 2 months before the opening of Disneyland, the Mark I was run through its test drive on the Walt Disney Studio backlot. Roger Brogie's son, Michael, was put behind the wheel and given directions by Bob Gurr, and by the time these tests were done, it was decided that the cars were ready to roll. Of the 40 Mark I's, 32 of them were used as motored cars, 4 were turned into police cars, 3 were used for promotional events and parades, and 1 as the Disneyland Autopia Special. And when I first heard Disneyland Autopia Special, I couldn't help wondering what exactly that was. And as it turns out, it was built under the direction of Bob Gurr as a custom-made vehicle just for Walt Disney. This sparkling metallic maroon car usually sat on display near the attraction's queue entrance, when it wasn't being used touring the nation to promote Disneyland. And seriously, out of the original 40, it really was quite special. It had special brass knockoffs to hold the spinnings over the wheels. Its bumper was from an actual 1953 Pontiac that was sliced, re-welded, and re-chromed to look like new. The upholstery was even specially tailored with red and off-white leatherette. Instead of a grab bar, a plastic windshield was added. Also, Walt's Autopia Special had no governor, so it would zip right up to the vehicle's max 25 miles per hour. And Walt Disney was even known to periodically visit Autopia to speak with senior Autopia foreman Frank E. Smith, and then sometimes take his custom car for a spin on Autopia's track. This maroon marvel here was eventually brought to the Walt Disney Studio, where it got even more modifications. A gear for going in reverse was installed, as well as custom chrome hubcaps along with silver accents to the paint job. It even got a custom license plate with the name Chris, the name of Walt's firstborn grandson. It was kept at the studio so Chris and his sister Joanna could drive it around the back lot, again with no governor. Today, the Disneyland Autopia Special is the only remaining Autopia Mark I model in existence, and it can be viewed in Gallery 9 of the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco. Though for some reason it's now red, and I couldn't find out why anyone would change the color of Walt's car. The police cars were created so Autopia's operators, or cast members as they would be called today, could give rides to children too small to drive on their own. Again, there were no guide rails in these early days, so for an added thrill, these cast member-driven police cars had sirens, flashing lights, and no governors, so they could also hit the faster 25 miles per hour. While the Mark I's were being developed, other members of the Autopia team searched for a company to sponsor the attraction, and found one at almost the last minute in May of 1955, 2 months before the opening of Disneyland, the Richfield Oil Corporation. Richfield quickly put together and circulated all kinds of ads promoting their years-ahead Richfield attractions at Disneyland. More specifically, their new Richfield Ethyl gasoline and its unsurpassed top-octane power. Essentially bragging about Autopia's cars running on Richfield Oil Corporation's tetraethyl-leaded gasoline. For their sponsorship, Disney reminded guests to fill up their tanks with the official gasoline of Disneyland, as well as to remember to use the gasoline that gives that extra get up and go to the family auto. Furthermore, to make this even easier to remember, Richfield had 3 locations conveniently surrounding Disneyland, one of which was located right outside of the Disneyland Hotel. The phone numbers to these stations was even listed in the 1960 Disneyland telephone directory. And on top of all that, Disney offered free Disneyland comic books to Richfield Station customers. In turn, Richfield gave away road maps showing the easiest ways to reach Disneyland. These were even handed out to the press to assist them in arriving at Disneyland for its opening day. The fueling relationship between the Richfield and Disney corporations, for its duration, was nothing short of exemplary. The Richfield Autopia awning was designed to resemble a fueling station. In fact, some years later, there would even be an actual Richfield pumping station for the Autopia vehicles. The original sign over the queue was partially designed by Italian art director Gabriele Scognamillo, whom I can't find a single picture of, so I'm just going to represent him with Jiminy Cricket here. Anyways, Scognamillo also designed a slew of other Tomorrowland areas, like the Tomorrowland Automat, Tomorrowland exhibit halls, and the yellow canopies that were all around Tomorrowland, as well as the 4 Richfield fueling pumps near the Richfield Autopia loading zone. Kind of a funny thing about Scognamillo, he and Walt Disney supposedly didn't get along very well. They fought repeatedly over the design direction of Tomorrowland, with Walt claiming Scognamillo was inflexible, egotistical, and driven toward his own concepts rather than what was best for Disneyland. According to Joe Fowler, Scognamillo was surprisingly fired before the park ever opened, making him the only person personally fired by Walt Disney who nonetheless has their name on a window on Main Street, USA. I should look into how that came to be. In any case, the actual Richfield Autopia sign in neon was provided by QRS Neon after they won the bid, a company from Los Angeles widely known for their services throughout the county of Los Angeles. All within 9 to 10 weeks before Disneyland's opening. Really, the more I learn about the creation of Disneyland, the more I learn about the immense pressures to make deadlines. The fact that anything was ready on opening day is astounding. It takes years to get so much as a single attraction up and going today, and yet the construction of Disneyland was entirely done over the course of roughly 1 year. The half-mile track was devised and constructed with the idea that drivers were navigating through a colorful countryside on a freeway, bypassing trees and other fine greenscapes. Though in truth, much of the landscaping wasn't completed by opening day. Wouldn't be completed for some years in fact, but I'll explain that in just a bit. They made up for it. The Autopia freeway was created at about half scale. In spite of the landscaping gaps, there were 20-watt fluorescent lamps standing at 9 feet 6 inches above the roadway, spaced on 20 and 30-foot centers. Keep in mind, as I mentioned, this freeway concept was futuristic to many guests of Disneyland at the time, and that most states in America didn't have a modern expressway. It meshed nicely within the Tomorrowland scenery, as well as adding a touch of color and nature. Interestingly, one of the early design ideas I ran across for Autopia featured a bus station. It seems Bob Gurr had planned for a small Autopia bus to carry younger guests through what was going to be called the Treeway of the future, that unfortunately never materialized. Then came Disneyland's opening day. On the press preview day parade, Don DeFore and Jerry Colonna drove the parade route in the black and white cars.
What's the matter? You've never seen a black and white before?
Because I didn't know who any of these celebrities were, I'll go ahead and mention that Don DeFore was best known as the next-door neighbor on the Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet sitcom, as well as Hazel, which garnered him a Primetime Emmy Award. And Jerry Colonna was one of Bob Hope's zaniest sidekicks. Furthermore, he voiced the March Hare in Alice in Wonderland. He played a wide range of what he called nitwitted characters.
You've been to England, Russia, Australia, Africa, and Alaska.
Yes. I'll get one of your checks cashed yet.
And hey, even Richard Nixon was at Disneyland that day.
Whether they're adults or children, want to come to Disneyland to see America, the past, the present, and the future.
Pleasantries aside, Disneyland's opening day at Autopia was a proverbial train wreck. Twice as many people showed than expected due to counterfeiters and such. And by such, I mean individuals that just climbed over the fence to swarm into the park. Anyways, many in attendance had the attitude that they were going to ride the Autopia cars no matter what. And some, grown-ups mind you, were apparently too good for waiting in line. Since the inspiration for Autopia was the innovating multi-lane freeways being constructed around the country, it shouldn't be very surprising to learn that the attraction was an instant sensation when it debuted. More than a sensation, it drove some people clear off the brink of sanity. A number of these gate jumpers and wayward trespassers ran up to the track and literally pulled people out of the cars so they could jump in themselves and drive off in their very own Mark I. Though where they were going, other than the obvious direction upon a paved track, goes to show that they clearly weren't thinking rationally. This wasn't a single incident, by the way. It happened many times. Bob Gurr tactfully phrases it as people commandeering vehicles, but really, they were manhandling people out of the cars for themselves. Autopia therefore proved to be more than a mere attraction. It so resonated with the public, capturing the imagination of what was to come in America, that it stood for something grander. Moreover, it was stylish, lavish, and inspiring. It wasn't about speed, it was about progress, civilization, ingenuity, and this drove a number of people completely bonkers. A really neat side thing about these earlier Autopia days from 1955 to 1960 was that children were put through an obstacle course of sorts. If they passed, as everyone did, they received a Disneyland operator's card, allowing them to drive on Autopia's freeway, as well as serving as an absolutely perfect souvenir. However, within a month of Disneyland's opening, it was fairly obvious that Autopia had some real issues. Guests, whether accidentally, on purpose, or just too young to properly control the vehicles, were crashing into one another. Occasionally, some yahoo would turn their car completely around, creating a serious risk for head-on collisions. And since the cars weren't trussed to any sort of implementation, there weren't even side railings. A car would sometimes jump the curbs and end up off-road into the relatively sparse landscape. In short, the situation was an unmitigated mess. In spite of Roger Brogy's earlier novel big spring-like bumper system on his take with the Studebaker vehicle, the Mark I's didn't have bumpers. And it didn't appear that simply asking people not to crash their cars into one another was going to play out. Within a matter of weeks of Disneyland's opening, they got Memeco on the horn to ask them to come back to design and fabricate bumpers, which Martindale and Mangles did, akin to Roger Brogy's idea by surrounding each entire car with a bumper. These bumpers were made of 3/8-inch thick aluminum plates. Aluminum, of course, to keep the weight down, yet strong enough to withstand the shock from collisions. And interestingly, Memeco added some other new features too. Adding chrome handrails on the cowl, covering the dashboards with foam rubber, the headlights were connected to a friction-driven generator, and, probably as important as the bumper implementation, the automatic braking system was installed, so when the pressure on the accelerator pedals was released, the cars would immediately brake. These fancy new enhancements minimized injuries, but didn't completely solve Autopia's mounting problems. Bob Gurr explained that during these early days following the opening, that a lot of the cars were breaking down, known as failing, and no one had figured out the support side of the attractions. Bob Gurr had taken to repairing the cars with his own tools on site. While in the midst of these repairs, Walt happened on by one day and saw the whole scene, and straight out asked Bob what he needed. Bob proceeded to tell him that they needed mechanics to work on the cars, and some kind of a facility to fix them. Within an hour, a tractor came along, dragging an old building. The tractor's operator then turned to Bob, saying, "Here's your building, where do you want it?" Furthermore, Bob Gurr also found mechanics on site when he arrived the next morning, too. It's a neat story, right? Bob always has the best stories. I always debate whether to mention his tougher personal stories about Walt Disney. Anyway, Autopia's popularity never waned in spite of the dangers. In fact, over the course of the first few months, the ardor towards the attraction developed into a sort of motor mania. Automotive exhibitions descended upon the park in early 1956. There was a huge American Motors Nash automobile exhibit featured in a magazine campaign, where they parked Nash automobiles in picturesque locations around Disneyland. Shots were taken in Town Square, Fantasyland, the Painted Desert, and the Central Plaza. And it didn't end there. Sports car Concours d'Elegance, another car exhibit, was held in April of 1956. This one brought in full-scale, one-of-a-kind racing cars, like the Abarth 207A, to the park. Also, ignore the 214C on the side in this picture. It's an Abarth 1100 model 207A. These events revved up interest in Tomorrowland to nearly a fever pitch, further increasing the traffic in Tomorrowland.
Boy, look at that traffic down there. How about we go out to Chuck in Traffic Central? Chuck, how are the things looking on the jam cams?
When Walt Disney proclaimed that Disneyland would continue to grow and add new things, no one really expected him to make good on it so quickly. On July 23, 1956, 40 new Autopia Mark IIs were put on Disneyland's first all-new attraction, the Richfield Jr. Autopia in Fantasyland. It took over the site of the former Mickey Mouse Club circus, and was essentially an Autopia for younger, shorter drivers. These new Mark IIs each had a new chassis with sturdier, smoother-running engines. They also featured booster seats and extender blocks on the pedals for the shorter drivers that would be using them. Magic Circle magazine reported at the time that these Mark IIs were given daily inspections and grease jobs. The oil changed once, if not twice a week, especially during the busier summer months. Ultimately, the Richfield Jr. Autopia only lasted for 2 years, closing in September of 1958, but it impactfully helped fill a demand during a time when guests were extremely interested in driving. They were designed for 6 to 16-year-olds, though were said to accommodate 2 adults if necessary. Even with the aluminum bumpers, I've actually read reports which claimed over the course of Disneyland's first year and a half that the 36 cars used for the day-to-day use for Tomorrowland's Autopia was gradually reduced down to 6. Which sounds ridiculous that there would be so few cars because the ride remained a phenomenal hit into 1956. There's no way they were operating with only 6 vehicles, but I do believe some of the cars must have been pulled out of service given Autopia's popularity. It was doing so well, in fact, that Walt developed a prototype Mark III which released in 1957. This vehicle design had a new engine, ball-lock clutch, and a gearbox, which is essentially a transmission. It helps to transfer power from the engine to the wheels by using different gear ratios. But these were by no means the only changes made. Due to the incredible popularity and high volume, it was decided the entire Autopia freeway track would need to be improved. The track was widened to support 2 lanes and 2 loading zones. A new triangular-shaped station was created, where guests were offered a view of the cars passing through the underpass. There was so much newness, but these new Mark IIIs had the same fiberglass bodies as the Mark Is, literally. Same candy outside coating, but now with peanuts sort of thing, so most guests never realized the difference. Joe Fowler, Disneyland's operations committee, oversaw the construction and maintenance, as well as the engineering, new construction maintenance, and janitorial. You get the idea. Joe Fowler oversaw Autopia's construction, as he did as construction manager over the entire Disneyland project. Afterward, he was Disneyland's general manager for 10 years. With the hindsight of who the Admiral here really was, his involvement in this is really a mere speck in the larger scheme of his accomplishments. When it came to park building, he got things done. He found the right people, he motivated those people to get working, he was known for making the impossible happen. Anytime Walt asked anything of him, however crazy it sounded, he was always known to say, "Can do." You may have noticed the tribute to Joe Fowler if you've taken the ferry from the Transportation and Ticket Center to the Magic Kingdom, or vice versa, what have you. There's a ferry named after him, the Admiral Joe Fowler. And this has nothing to do about Joe Fowler, or the Mark III for that matter, but in 1957, again because Autopia was so enormously popular, yet another third, though much smaller version of the attraction opened in Fantasyland. The unfortunately named Midget Autopia was created for even younger drivers in mind than the Junior Autopia. These cars were typically too small to accommodate adults, though if they could fit and didn't exceed the weight limit, they were welcome to enjoy, and each car had 2 functional steering wheels. There's a famous quote by Bob Gurr where he said that if it moves on wheels at Disneyland, I probably designed it. The 10 cars manufactured for Midget Autopia falls within this small margin of possibility. Bob Gurr didn't design it, didn't have anything to do with it at all. The cars, as well as the attraction itself, were in fact designed and created by Arrow Development. And they called it the Aeroflight. What's more, this version of Autopia was not at all new. Before Disneyland got theirs, Arrow Development had already installed these Aeroflights at other amusement parks. From Seattle to Palo Alto, Houston, New York, they were all over the place. However, interestingly, this was the first Autopia to be outfitted with a center guide rail, so this sliver of Disney history isn't without consequence.
Good.
Disney quantified the mileage of the Mark Is and IIIs over their first year and a half to 21 trips around the Earth. However, the cars were still taking a tremendous beating. Nowhere else on the planet were cars getting a tougher daily treatment. So Bob Gurr came in, now director of Special Vehicle Development, and tested yet another new Autopia model. Well, models. There were in fact 11 of them. All of Bob Gurr's design. He put each of these fabricated designs through a rigorous 300-hour test. Disneyland's guests drove them all day, while special drivers drove them all through the night. It was an around-the-clock operation. Mechanics watched on, adding gas and oil, but were instructed not to lay a wrench to any of the cars. Some of Bob's designs lasted only a few hours, so Bob took these back to the machine shop to evaluate, redesign, and rebuild them, and then put them right back in with the others on Autopia's track. After 2 weeks, there was only 1 car left rounding the track without any failures, and this became the Mark IV. The previous Mark 1s and 3s, now totaling 79 vehicles, were completely rebuilt into new Mark 4s. And they were all soon traversing Autopia at a mean 9 miles per hour. Bob designed these Mark 4s to be easily repairable and require very little maintenance, and when they did need maintenance, they were designed for the process to be quick and efficient. The engine and wheel could be simply removed by unfastening a single pin. By the summer of 1957, the Tomorrowland Autopia's construction for wider tracks was complete. There were more drivers rounding the course, new Mark 4s tacking on practically countless miles. Things had certainly changed over the first 2 years for Autopia, including the name. The attraction was altered to the very flat and pragmatic title of Autopia Cars and Freeway. Yet still, this was all just a placeholder for what was to come. By 1958, Autopia was more popular than ever. A more permanent open-front service garage was constructed and in full operation. In January of 1959, the Junior Autopia reopened in Fantasyland as a second multi-level Super Autopia track. From that point forward, known as Fantasyland Autopia. It was tough to call it Junior anymore because the track was just as long as Tomorrowland's Autopia, and used the same Mark 4s, both still fueled by Richfield. And then, in June of 1959, sometimes known as Gala Day at Disneyland, the greatest Disney expansion ever took place. It was the unveiling of the monorail, submarine voyage, the Matterhorn bobsleds, a revised Skyway, and a new multi-tiered, multi-level Tomorrowland Autopia. The freeways were finally given the multitudes of trees and beautiful landscapes they deserved. Dazzling fields of native California poppies in the spring, the crepe myrtle trees displaying their pink canopies in the summer. It was a majestic sight to behold, all the while behind the wheel of brand new Mark 5s. I always enjoy learning more about Gala Day. Alright, so Dave Gengenbach, which is a fun name to say, created the frame and running gear for the Mark 5. These stylishly sleek new cars also had air-cooled engines and got even better gas mileage than previous vehicles. The 4-gallon tanks would run for a solid 12 hours without needing refueling. Each Mark V, while on this new track, was estimated to run 850,000 miles a year. But while doing research, it seems all people really seemed to like about the Mark Vs were the shiny chrome headlights, repurposed from Buick parts, by the way. Later on, Dave Gengenbach became the general manager at Maypo, as well as holding many other titles. He also oversaw Space Mountain, Carousel of Progress, and both the Mark III and IV monorail systems. There were 75 Mark Vs, and regrettably, they were not without their share of performance problems. They were heavy one-cylinder vehicles, so they continually suffered from suspension failures, meaning the steering felt loose. Also meaning if someone was steering to go straight, the vehicle continually kept veering in another direction, which Disney had to keep repeatedly fixing. Autopia was a blur of motion throughout the first half of the 1960s. Between the nearby motorboats maneuvering along Tomorrowland, the Skyway and monorails overhead, viewable submarines submerging, the ambience surrounding Autopia was a busy place. Busy in a bustling sort of way I always wish the Magic Kingdom would try to emulate but never does, other than perhaps the People Mover. The Mark V's era lasted roughly 6 years. That's 2 years longer than the Mark I, II, III, and IVs combined. Once into the 1960s, Richfield decided to design new Autopia operators' licenses for younger motorists who completed their circuit. However, for some reason, the old Mark I, II, III, and IVs were pictured on the cards rather than the Mark Vs. In 1963, Walt Disney brought along Bob Gurr to visit the Santa Cruz Boardwalk to see a new Autorama attraction. This futuristic auto attraction was designed by Arrow Development. However, unlike the Arrow flights, this was a larger, more mature version. What's more, it possessed a center guide rail. This trip to Santa Cruz and the conversations during it led to Autopia's own guide rail system, as well as the unprecedented Mark VI vehicles. The Mark VIs debuted in 1964. Way too many sources on the internet describe these vehicles as having an all-new design. And you know, there were some big changes. The wraparound bumper was nixed, the headlights, which people were so enamored by, were inexplicably gone, the new body was sleek and interesting in its way, but it just outright resembled the previous Mark V, which some designer bewilderingly decided to just leave the headlights out. I'm really not sure what that was all about. I couldn't find out much about the Mark VI's alteration process. I don't even know if Bob Gurr had a hand in its design. I don't know whose hands did any of this. Although, overall, the attraction itself was greatly enhanced, Walt Disney and Bob Gurr's trip to Santa Cruz wasn't wasted. The guide rail systems were finally put in place in 1964, and the Tomorrowland Autopia attraction was changed to the Super Autopia Freeway, presented by Richfield. And 2 years later, during the summer of 1966, there were great enhancements done to Autopia's landscape and flower situation. The nurserymen who routinely maintained the landscaping were actually written a public word of thanks by Wally Bogue, the Disneyland backstage editor, for their floral handiwork. 1966 also marked the end of Midget Autopia in Disneyland to make way for the much more prominent It's a Small World attraction. This kid attraction was then moved to Marceline, Missouri that same year, widely regarded as Walt's hometown, where the attraction delighted families for 11 years before closing down due to a shortage of parts. The areas for its tracks still reside there as a remnant of pleasant days gone past. And then, 3 short years later in 1967, Disney shifted gears and designed the Mark VII, the absolute pinnacle of Autopia vehicle design. This memorable design was inspired by the Corvette Stingray. The zenith had been reached. Nearly everything about these cars was completely new and different from previous versions, except for the 7.5 horsepower motors. This was the work of Bob Gurr and Aero Development combined. Manufactured by Aero Development to Bob Gurr's specifications. These new vehicles had padded seating, new bumpers and such, and when all told weighed 1,100 pounds, twice as much as previous versions, which accounted for what felt like a slightly slower speed, despite it having the exact same horsepower. The average max speed hit roughly 6.2 miles per hour, but I didn't run across anyone complaining, because the exciting look of the car was something everyone just wanted to jump into. It really goes to show that the emotion a car manifests is what seals the deal in the minds of drivers. The maintenance of the Mark VIIs was rendered down to a science. 9 mechanics worked daily maintenance and cyclical rehabilitations. Every year, 36 of the 159 Mark VIIs would be stripped down and rebuilt with new parts, the bodies repaired and then given fresh paint jobs. Each of these durable vehicles cost way more than any other Mark series, possibly as much as all of the other Mark designs combined, but it was more than worth it. The Mark 1 through 6s lasted a total of 12 years. The Mark 7 lasted over 30 years, retiring in 1999, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. The Richfield sponsorship of Autopia dissolved in 1970 after Disneyland Participant Affairs and Participant Richfield failed to negotiate a new cooperative agreement. As such, the majestic yellow and blue Richfield Eagle, clutching its boron molecule, was removed from Autopia's queue, leaving the attraction sponsorless. Then came the energy crisis in the late 1970s. Disneyland, along with its 9 gasoline-powered attractions, were listed as one of the 4 major local industrial polluters in a press article, though whether this was exactly true was never adequately substantiated. You can see how the writer came up with the idea, though. There were dozens of Autopia cars running on gasoline during a gasoline shortage, spewing emissions non-stop all day long. It wasn't exactly a good look. Disney, of course, stated that the Mark VIIs didn't pump out anywhere near as much emissions as a typical automobile. But with no scientific data supporting either side, the conversation sort of stalemated before dissipating. There's not much information about Autopia's era through the 1970s and 80s, though. I heard rumors that they closed the attraction down to 1 lane during the gas shortage, but I can't substantiate that. In 1991, Autopia's long stretch of popularity had gradually eased off the gas enough to make Fantasyland Autopia a bit superfluous. So Disney rethemed it as a Rescue Rangers Raceway, named after the Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers show. Not being particularly popular, this ended a year later in 1992, once again named the Fantasyland Autopia. However, during this go-around, the attraction was only open during Disneyland's busier days. The Fantasyland Autopia finally closed in 1999. It also coincides with the last year of the Mark 7s, which, as I said, had over a 30-year run. Tomorrowland's Autopia also closed for that matter, in a manner of speaking, because technically these two closures were temporary closures. And that's because in June of the year 2000, a new, larger, grander, more expansive Autopia emerged as the Chevron Autopia. It was a whole new age and sponsor in the Autopia saga. This fresh, clean, shiny Tomorrowland Autopia was so large, it even spread across the old Fantasyland Autopia territory. For the time, it was really something. This new era also unfortunately resulted in new vehicles, which were a far cry if compared to the sleek Mark 7s of yesterdecades. These so-called Mark 8s came in three colorful styles. There was Dusty, a sort of off-road style vehicle, Sparky, a sports car, which it's hard to view it as being a sports car given that the Mark 7 actually looked like a sports car. Anyways, the last one was Susie, a straight-up Volkswagen Beetle-type doohickey, none of which were exactly thrilling. These anthropomorphic cars also had their own spunky personalities, which gave the safety spiel while guests waited in a nice queue area, played over the former Disneyland People Mover theme music, which I'm sure unintentionally just twisted the knife in the backs of guests that groaned over the heydays of the Mark 7s and the Disneyland People Mover. But cars and queue music aside, with Chevron sponsorship, the attraction's theming became a bit about racing, which I see why some Imagineer would consider this a good idea, but is nonetheless a poor premise, all things considered. Guests don't exactly race one another. Also, the cars have always looked sleek and quick, but they never moved altogether very fast, in most cases. Also, the attraction is in Tomorrowland, where car racing doesn't precisely fit, so it makes little sense to make the attraction about racing. Just like the Magic Kingdom version, it just leaves people thinking the attraction is a watered-down experience that's only for kids. The attraction's original intent was to showcase the future, to take in scenic landscapes, an experience to be enjoyed. Now the premise was to pretend in your mind that you're a racer while you're not going fast, so you have to pretend you're going fast. It's clunky to say the least. An average go-kart goes 2.5 to 10 miles per hour faster than Autopia's vehicles, depending on where you go, and with no guide rail. It's silly to compete with that. Chevron sponsorship ended in 2012. I mean, the end is said to have occurred in 2010 when some signage was pulled, but I believe there were some smaller contracts that lasted a bit longer. And Disney states the sponsorship is ending in 2012. So there you go.
That's what they done did said.
After the departure of Chevron sponsorship came Honda's sponsorship in 2016. The attraction closed for 4 months so a new building, walkway, sign, and all the in-betweens could be reconstructed. Every indication of Chevron was completely removed, except the fiberglass bodies of the cars, which seems to be all people really cared about, but never mind that. Each car was refitted with IGX 270 engines and 4 gleaming new tires. 270 cc's of fun, they generate 8.5 horsepower at 3,600 RPM. No longer rattling lawnmowers of old, the cars now include variable timing digital CDI ignition, which I had zero notion what that meant, so I looked it up, and it essentially means the speed of the engine is monitored by an electric device that provides optimum timing for the spark. There's also less maintenance necessary overall. At fast speeds, it sort of works less, peaking at 4,500 RPM, but at Autopia speeds, it's perfect. Honda's Autopia cars have CARB and EPA certifications, meaning they pass some seriously rigorous emission standards. They also have more power, quieter performance, and lower fuel consumption, which also equates to lower emissions. You still floor the pedal to 6.5 miles per hour or so, but it feels like faster, if not smoother, than the marks of the past. Essentially, each of these engines can be found in any high-end air compressor or wood chipper. And Honda boldly stands behind their Autopia cars, stating they're clean and fuel efficient. In spite of the humongous changes made to practically everything but the pitiful chevron fiberglass bodies, I can't find anyone anywhere referring to these vehicles as the Mark IX. The bodies were at least repainted by Honda with far more ebullient colors from their corporate repertoire. Honda logos were also set into the front and rear of every vehicle, though it's a bit strange to see Honda's logo on an inspired Beetle, and the green shade always reminds me of green Skittles. Anyway, with Honda as the sponsor, Autopia's driver's licenses were brought back too. And in 2017, Honda's Asimo was introduced to Autopia's landscape. Asimo standing for Advanced Step and Innovative Mobility, though that being the case, there isn't an explanation for the O at the end. However, in Japanese, asi means leg and mo means mobility, which makes more sense, seeing as how Asimo here was initially created as Honda's experimental line of walking robots with wireless movements. Asimo was actually pretty neat. It could recognize objects, postures, gestures, sounds, and faces, enabling it to interact with people. Not the one out by Autopia's tracks, mind you, this one mostly stood still. Anyway, this robot and its robotic friend named Bird was featured for several years doing all kinds of stuff, with his bird. Just a robot and his robotic bird out in nature. I still don't quite understand how it all fits together, but it is quaint in its own way. I don't think the hijinks really hit the way classic Disney attractions did in the past, but they can't all be Pirates of the Caribbean. And despite 70 years of reminders, bumpers, and middle guide rails, people still manage to hit one another in the cars. And I get that there are some people who have complaints about Autopia. There are people who don't like the fumes, and that's understandable, that Autopia doesn't fit in Tomorrowland given that nothing about it is futuristic at all, or that the speed of the vehicles is too slow. However, what I find baffling is that Disney doesn't simply fix these issues. By simply increasing the speed of the cars a mere few more miles per hour, which was feasible as far back as during its creation, making them electric, adding some keen curved racetrack-esque turns, and elongating the track to make up for the increased speed so the attraction's duration remains the same, it would be pretty easy to update the classic attraction while retaining the core of its essence. And though there's no telling what the future of Autopia may hold, a Honda spokesperson did say that although Honda has committed to a 10-year sponsorship, that an all-electric drivetrain was considered, and is a possibility in the future. Which, given recent reports, does actually seem to now be the case. Which means it's likely that if Honda renews sponsorship in 2027 and more funds are put forward, that an electric vehicle will finally become a reality. I can't confirm when this may have taken place, but a supposed cast member said an electric car was tested for Autopia a good number of years ago. However, this sounds suspicious, but this electric test car supposedly had a rough time getting up hills, particularly once its battery lost its full charge. These rumored electric cars also supposedly needed to be rotated in and out throughout the day for battery recharging. Although, I have to say, it's weird that Hong Kong Disneyland was able to figure out how to utilize an electric vehicle, but that these changes couldn't be outfitted for Disneyland's Autopia, or the Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland Speedway for that matter. So this rumor is very suspicious.
Highly suspect!
Disney's Autopia has almost become a staple for Disney parks. There's one at Disneyland Paris, Hong Kong Disneyland, the Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland Speedway, and even though it's no longer in operation, it used to be at Tokyo Disneyland's Grand Circuit Raceway, from the park's grand opening day until 2017 to make way for a Beauty and the Beast themed area. The only park that hasn't had a rendition is Shanghai. Autopia is a classic Disney attraction, blurring the distinction of reality, fantasy, and tomorrow. For many, it's practically a rite of passage, getting behind a wheel for the first time, a part of the fabric of mainstream American culture. If it were ever removed, it feels as though when future generations educate or produce media on the topic of driving, that footage of Autopia perfectly fits when describing the childhoods of the 20th century, and possibly the 21st. Cars, hot rods, the entire automotive genre is intrinsically tied to America's history, and Disney just so happened to be a part of that. Bob Gurr too, inspiring the generations ahead, unquestionably fueling self-propelled vehicles and travel to wherever it might lead. Autopia fits in Tomorrowland. The attraction fits in Disney's parks. Hopefully, future iterations of Autopia will further prove that. Please hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. Thank you so much for watching, and Disfarers out.